I'm Alex Mercer, 47 years old, and last fall the HOA fined me $2,000 for running a commercial operation out of my home because I had a desk in my den and a landline phone. That's it. No foot traffic, no signage, no deliveries, just a man sitting quietly in his own home, working. The notice was taped to my door in a bright red envelope, like it was some eviction warning. Cease all business operations immediately or face further penalties. A week later, I was summoned to an HOA board meeting where the president, Karen Templeton, of course, declared in front of the entire neighborhood that I was operating a shady business in violation of community values. She said, "This neighborhood deserves better than to be turned into a strip mall by someone too cheap to rent an office downtown." The room laughed, or at least some of them did. The others looked down uncomfortable. I just stood there, hands at my sides, feeling humiliated. I'd lived in that house for 12 years. Kept my lawn trimmed, paid every HOA due, never made noise, never had a single complaint, until Karen decided I was next. It wasn't about zoning, it was about power, control, and image. Karen had built a reputation in our HOA as the protector of property values, and people like me, quiet, independent, boring, were easier targets than someone with money or a loud lawyer. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had something she didn't. Patience. And a memory like a steel trap. But before I tell you what happened on that day, let me explain how it all began. Before the conflict started, my life was exactly the kind of quiet most people dream about. I had left my government position at the county office 3 years earlier to work from home. The stress of managing zoning permits, political agendas, and late-night council meetings had worn me down to the bone. I wanted peace, and I thought I'd found it in Willow Creek. My home sat on a tree-lined street, one of those mid-century modern brick homes with a modest front lawn and a maple tree that turned brilliant red every October. My office, it wasn't much. Just a converted spare bedroom with a second-hand desk, a file cabinet, and a few monitors for reviewing land records and blueprints on freelance contracts. I never advertised, never had clients over. The most disruptive sound coming out of that room was the occasional squeak of my office chair. The neighbors mostly left me alone, and I returned the favor. Mr. Davidson next door walked his dog every morning like clockwork. Miss Alvarez across the street watered her hydrangeas at 7 a.m., even in winter. There was a rhythm to it all, a comfortable predictability. I liked it that way. Then Karen moved in. Her house sat 2 doors down, a white colonial with shiny black shutters, and a flagpole planted dead center in the yard. She wasted no time inserting herself into neighborhood politics. Within 3 months, she'd gotten herself elected as HOA president. The old board members didn't even resist. They were tired and probably relieved to hand it off to someone with that much energy. At first, her presence was more amusing than anything. She handed out laminated rulebooks at the block party. She called a lawn inspection committee into existence. She asked Mr. Davidson to tone down the barking, referring to his dog, not the man. People joked about it behind her back. Neighborhood Karen, they'd whisper at the mailboxes, chuckling. But underneath the laughter, something shifted. Karen wasn't content with order. She wanted control, and she picked her battles like a prosecutor. It started with tiny things. Friendly reminders on trash cans left out too long. A neighbor told me she received a notice for her wind chimes being too musical. Another had to repaint his mailbox after Karen decided the shade of blue violated visual consistency. These weren't formal citations at first, just warnings, but the warnings turned into votes. Votes turned into policy changes. Then she turned her attention to me. I noticed it in passing at first, her glance lingering when she walked by my house, her squint when she saw the blinds drawn in the middle of the afternoon, a clipboard in her hand during one of her routine perimeter reviews. I once caught her standing at the edge of my driveway, just staring at my windows. Still, I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. One Saturday morning, I saw her out walking with her dog, a little white puffball that yipped more than it barked. I stepped out and offered a polite wave. "Morning," I said. She barely glanced up. "Mr. Mercer," she nodded, eyes darting up toward the second-floor window. "Everything all right?" I asked. "I've had a few questions from neighbors," she said flatly. "About traffic, people seeing cars coming and going, that sort of thing." "There hasn't been any traffic," I replied, confused. "I work from home. I barely leave." She gave me a tight-lipped smile. "That's what they said. Still, I thought I'd mention it." That was the moment I knew. It wasn't about traffic. It wasn't about rules. It was about suspicion, about optics, about how things looked from the outside. Karen didn't like not knowing what someone was doing, especially someone like me who kept to themselves. A few days later, the red citation showed up on my door. I stood there on the porch for 10 minutes staring at it. It was absurd. A violation citing me for unauthorized commercial operation. It referenced a subsection of our HOA charter that hadn't been updated since the early 2000s, a generic clause designed for people who ran loud hair salons or daycare centers from their homes, not for a former government worker typing quietly at a computer. I should have laughed, but I didn't. I felt something deeper than annoyance. It was humiliation. I'd spent my career helping people navigate land use laws, keeping people from being crushed by bureaucracy. And now I was being strangled by it, by someone who didn't even understand what she was enforcing. I appealed the notice in writing. Karen denied it in less than 24 hours. A few nights later, I found an anonymous flyer taped to my mailbox. Do you know what your neighbor does behind closed doors? Commercial activity affects your property value. Speak up. I didn't need handwriting analysis to figure out who it came from. The next HOA board meeting was the final straw. Karen stood at the front of the room reading from a typed list of violations currently under review. When she got to my name, she smiled. Mr. Mercer, she said, has been conducting an unapproved business in a residential zone. He's refused to comply with multiple notices. We may be forced to seek legal action. I opened my mouth to speak, but she cut me off. We welcome questions from compliant home owners, she said, looking right at me. But rule breakers will be handled according to procedure. This isn't personal. It's about protecting the integrity of Willow Creek. The room was dead silent. And in that silence, something inside me hardened. She wanted a rulebook war. She was about to find out who wrote the damn book. The next morning, I stood in my kitchen, holding that red citation again, my thumb slowly rubbing the corner until it curled. I stared out the window, watching Karen walk her dog with military precision, head high, leash tight, clipboard tucked under one arm, like she was preparing for an audit of the neighborhood's soul. That was the moment I stopped feeling humiliated and started feeling focused. I pulled out a banker's box from my storage closet. Inside were years of archived documents, zoning maps, and legal memos from my time as deputy zoning director for the county. At the top was a thick binder labeled Residential Overlay Codes, Willow Creek HOA. I had helped write parts of that code. I'd testified in hearings when the county revised those land use restrictions back in 2012. I knew the spirit and the letter of every single clause they thought they could weaponize. But I wasn't going to rush in. That wasn't how this would work. Karen was playing chess with checkerboard understanding, and I intended to play her game by her rules, only better. Meanwhile, the HOA doubled down. I began receiving inspection reports from a new committee Karen had formed. They came weekly. One claimed I had light disturbances visible through second-story windows. Another said I had mail accumulation indicating abnormal activity. I lived alone. I received junk mail. It was absurd. Then the real threats started coming in. One letter cited continued violation and recommended a $200 a day fine. Another threatened the suspension of my access to shared amenities, which in my case amounted to a tiny gym with a broken elliptical and a pool that hadn't been cleaned since Memorial Day. I started to document everything, every letter, every timestamp, every quote from Karen at public meetings. I had a digital folder labeled Karen Befreien Enforcement Pattern and a spreadsheet cross-referencing her complaints with other residents' infractions. I started noticing something peculiar, or rather predictable. Karen's notices disproportionately targeted residents who didn't show up to meetings or who had previously voted against her proposed amendments. One neighbor had been fined for a fence that had been standing for 5 years. Another got cited for grass clippings on the sidewalk. These weren't violations, they were vendettas. I decided to attend the next board meeting again. Not to fight, just to watch, to listen, to let her keep digging. That night, the meeting room in the community clubhouse was full. Word had spread, Karen's enforcement blitz was raising eyebrows. I sat quietly in the back wearing a gray sweater and slacks, nondescript, invisible. Karen stood at the front like she always did, polished, commanding with a stack of manila folders and a PowerPoint titled Preserving the Value of Willow Creek. She ran through her list of updates. 8 new violations, a push to revise Article 4.3 to modernize commercial activity restrictions. And then she paused dramatically. And as many of you know, she said we've had ongoing issues with a resident, Mr. Mercer, operating a business out of his home. Despite warnings and citations, the activity continues. Let me be clear, this board will not back down from enforcing our rules. The integrity of our neighborhood is at stake. She looked right at me when she said that last part. This time I didn't flinch. I raised my hand calmly. She scowled but nodded. Mr. Mercer, I have a few clarifying questions. I said my tone level. According to Article 4.3, subsection C, the prohibition is on customer-facing business activity that disrupts residential character, correct? She blinked. Yes, but subsection D, I continued, expressly permits professional work from home as long as there's no signage, foot traffic, or exterior alteration. I meet all those conditions. Karen narrowed her eyes. Well, your activity appears disruptive. Appearances aren't violations, I said. They're opinions. A few neighbors chuckled softly. Karen flushed but recovered. Regardless, she snapped, we received complaints. From whom, I asked. Silence. I waited. I'm not at liberty to disclose. Of course, I said. Because if those complaints are anonymous and not substantiated with evidence, then citations issued based on them violate due process under the HOA charter. I helped write the policy. Karen's lips tightened like a drawstring bag. She tried to pivot. This isn't about you, Mr. Mercer. It's about community standards. Then perhaps the board should ensure it understands the standards before enforcing them. The room shifted. Not all at once, but I saw it, neighbors leaning forward. Someone whispered, another person scribbled a note. It was small, but it was a start. Karen ended the meeting quickly after that. The next day I received a letter marked final notice citing a refusal to comply and threatening legal escalation. That was it. Karen had moved from petty into reckless. She wanted a battle. She had no idea who she was dealing with. It was time to dust off my old credentials. I never wanted a war. I truly didn't. But when someone tries to bulldoze your dignity in the name of neighborhood integrity, you're left with two options, retreat or respond. I chose the latter. The very next morning, I sat down at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a mug of black coffee. I began making a list not of names but of structures, sheds, pergolas, driveway expansions, decorative columns, anything I'd casually observed in the neighborhood over the years that might violate residential code. Willow Creek had slowly evolved over the past decade, and a lot of homeowners had gotten creative with their outdoor projects. What they didn't know, and what Karen certainly didn't, was that every modification in a zoning overlay like ours had to be formally permitted, inspected, and certified by the county. I knew that because I helped write the very guidelines that governed it. For the past year, Karen had terrorized neighbors with arbitrary violations, most of which wouldn't hold up under actual code scrutiny. But the irony, her own backyard was a goldmine of infractions. I'd seen it once during a community BBQ, an enclosed sunroom addition jutting out into the setback line, a flagstone patio installed over public drainage, a built-in grill structure with gas lines visible under an open pergola, all completely unpermitted. She was breaking more rules than anyone she fined. But I wasn't going to make this personal. I couldn't. Not if I wanted it to stick. I needed this to be surgical, precise. So I created a new document folder titled Zoning Discrepancies Willow Creek and began logging structures. I took walks every morning and night, pretending to be on a health kick. I wore sunglasses and a Fitbit. No one paid me any mind, but I noticed everything. The Johnsons had an outdoor sauna built just 3 feet from the fence line. Code violation. The Palmers added a second driveway slab, likely without an impervious surface permit. Code violation. The Steiners turned their garage into a guest suite. If there was no change of use permit, it was illegal. Code violation. By the end of the week, I had a spreadsheet with 42 potential infractions, all cross-referenced by parcel number and zoning map. And then came the personal cost. I received a formal notice of lien from the HOA. Karen had pushed it through a closed-door vote authorizing the board to place a lien on my property for unpaid violation fines. The total $2,000 plus legal fees. The document said if the amount wasn't paid within 45 days, the HOA could begin foreclosure proceedings. That's when something in me snapped. You don't threaten someone's home unless you're prepared for what that awakens in them. I sat alone that evening, lights low, old case folders laid out like war plans. I felt rage, but it wasn't hot. It was cold, measured, methodical. I picked up my phone and called someone I hadn't spoken to in over a year. Donna Reed, my former coworker at the county zoning office. She'd stayed on after I left and now managed permit compliance. Alex, she said, surprised. It's been forever. I need to file some code review requests, I said calmly. Anonymous, through public access records. Can you point me to the right portal? A pause. Is this about Willow Creek? I exhaled slowly. It's about stopping a bully who doesn't realize she's standing in a house of cards. Dana chuckled. Well, now I'm intrigued. She guided me through the current submission process. I didn't need her to bend any rules. I just needed efficiency. Within 2 days, I had the forms. I submitted 14 zoning inspection requests to the county, each one tied to an address with likely code violations. I included photographic evidence, parcel maps, and GPS coordinates. I knew exactly what the inspection team would need to trigger a formal response. Within 48 hours, I received the first confirmation site inspection scheduled, 422 Fieldstone Drive. Karen's address. I sat back in my chair and stared at the email. She had no idea what was coming. But the cost wasn't just paperwork and stress. Neighbors started turning cold. Some whispered when I walked by. A few no longer returned my waves. I found a note on my windshield one morning. You're ruining this community. Stop being bitter. They didn't see what was happening. They only saw what Karen told them, that I was a rule breaker fighting against a board trying to protect them. Perception is a powerful weapon, especially when wielded by someone charismatic. One afternoon, I ran into Mr. Davidson by the mailbox. He didn't make eye contact at first, just shuffled his letters. Then he spoke, voice low. Karen said you were trying to get people's homes torn down. That true? I looked him straight in the eye. I'm making sure the rules apply equally. That's all. He nodded slowly, then said, for what it's worth, she's been on a power trip since day one. Do what you need to do. That moment mattered more than I expected. It reminded me that not everyone was fooled. Some people were just scared. I went home, opened my laptop, and submitted 5 more inspection requests. By the end of the week, I'd filed a total of 21. Karen had fired the first shot. I was just enforcing the law she pretended to understand. Karen didn't know it yet, but the clock was ticking. It began quietly. A few city inspectors dressed in plain polos and khakis started walking around the neighborhood with clipboards. Most residents probably assumed they were with the HOA. I knew better. These weren't friendly volunteers measuring shrubs. These were municipal inspectors from the zoning compliance office, and they were trained to notice everything from improper setbacks to utility line encroachments. Still, I kept my head down. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I let the wheels turn on their own. Until the second notice arrived, a new HOA letter. This time, Karen had gone further. The letter claimed that my refusal to comply with ongoing corrective orders constituted a material violation of covenant, giving the HOA the right to begin pre-foreclosure filing with the county. No hearing, no due process, just a bureaucratic noose tightening around my home, the same home I'd built a quiet life in. She was trying to evict me over a desk and a computer. I stared at the letter, cold rage settling in my chest. I hadn't felt that kind of pressure since my days handling emergency zoning injunctions during the floodplain disputes in Oak County. Back then, I kept homeowners from losing their homes to red tape. Now I was the target. I went for a walk. A long one, son. The sun was low amber slicing through the oaks. As I rounded the corner by the community tennis courts, I heard voices behind me. 2 women, talking low. He thinks he's better than everyone. Working from home doesn't mean you can ignore the rules. I heard Karen say he threatened to sue the board. I stopped at the edge of the sidewalk out of view and exhaled slowly. She was poisoning the well. That was the moment I knew. The gloves had to come off. The next morning, I sat down and drafted a formal legal letter, not from me, but on behalf of a fictional civic watchdog group I registered under State Law Citizens for Zoning Accountability. I created the LLC using an online portal and submitted the articles of organization with a nominal fee. It was legitimate, if barely. The letter read like a professional inquiry, polite, clinical, and direct. It referenced multiple confirmed violations in Willow Creek. It cited specific properties under investigation. It asked the HOA board for their permit archive and building modification approvals for the last 5 years. According to HOA law, that request must be honored if made by any interested civic entity. I CC'd the city's planning department and the county clerk. Then I mailed it, certified return receipt, requested. 3 days later, chaos bloomed. Karen's sunroom was flagged with a red notice, unpermitted structure subject to removal. A large white sticker from the city's zoning department was plastered on the sliding glass door. The structure extended 2 feet into a protected green setback zone, which meant mandatory removal within 30 days. I was sipping coffee on my porch when she saw it. Her scream cut through the air like a siren. "No! No! No!" she wailed, stumbling back out of her yard. She stared at the notice like it was a death sentence, her voice rising into a shrill panic. "This is a mistake. This is harassment." She yanked the notice off the door and stormed back inside. 10 minutes later, I saw her storming down the sidewalk in heels, holding her phone to her ear. Later that evening, I got an email from the HOA board, not from Karen, but from the treasurer, Tom Burke. It was short and cautious. "Mr. Mercer, the board would like to clarify recent actions. There appears to be confusion regarding enforcement practices, and we are pausing all proceedings against your property while we conduct an internal review." That was the first crack in their armor, but not the last. The next week, 6 more homes received violation notices from the city. 3 had to cease construction projects. 1 had to remove a carport. Another had to dig up part of their backyard where it encroached on a city easement. Homeowners were livid, not at me, but at the HOA, for never telling them they needed proper permits in the first place. Karen tried to spin it. She sent out a blast email titled "Attack on Willow Creek, an External Threat." She claimed a disgruntled resident had reported the entire neighborhood to the city in an attempt to destabilize property values. She said she was working closely with officials to undo the damage. The lie unraveled fast. Dana, my contact at the county, called me. "We've received 5 complaints in the last 2 days from your HOA board. Karen's been trying to claim the inspectors acted on false information. Problem is, we have the evidence now, permits were never filed." "Will they be forced to comply?" I asked. Dana chuckled darkly. "They already are. You just triggered a full audit." Karen's house was ground zero. That weekend, her patio grill station was cordoned off. She received a citation for illegal gas line extensions, a serious safety violation. A contractor came to remove a section of her pergola the following Tuesday. Her prized rose trellises were uprooted when inspectors discovered irrigation had ruptured into a protected storm drain. She stopped walking her dog, stopped appearing at board meetings. The same woman who once marched the sidewalks with a clipboard was now a ghost in her own kingdom. And I started walking with my head a little higher. I still hadn't spoken to her, but the message was clear. She had tried to bury me with policy. I had quietly taught her what policy actually meant. I didn't celebrate. Not yet. The moment Karen's empire began to collapse, I knew I had to tread even more carefully. Revenge that burns too hot draws attention. But poetic justice delivered in measured strokes that leaves a legacy. My next move wasn't about punishment, it was about precision. I dove deeper. The city inspectors had already triggered audits on 10 properties. But I knew how easily some violations could be patched up or downplayed with the right excuses. Karen might have been bleeding, but she was still HOA president, still had control over the board. If I wanted lasting change, I had to dismantle the very tools she used to dominate others. That meant bylaws. Most HOA boards rely on outdated, vague governing documents. Karen wielded ours like a sword, but she never expected anyone would challenge the fine print. She figured most people didn't understand what they were signing when they moved in. She was right, they didn't. I did. I pulled the governing documents, the CC&Rs, covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the articles of incorporation, and the HOA's enforcement policy. On paper, it looked legitimate, but buried in a footnote, Article 12, Section 3.4, was a clause that made me sit back in my chair and whistle softly. It read, "Any board member may be removed with a 2/3 vote of homeowners in good standing, provided the member has violated the HOA's conflict of interest policy." That was the loophole. Karen had issued fines to properties she herself had architectural influence over. Her own additions built without permits violated that same policy. That meant she'd fined others while benefiting from her own code breaking. On paper, that was abuse of power. I drafted a petition, clean, professional. It explained that the HOA president had knowingly enforced selective penalties while exempting her own property from compliance, and that as such, she had violated internal conflict of interest guidelines. I didn't send it yet. I needed signatures, 2/3 of the residents. But I couldn't knock on doors like a candidate. People were still nervous. Many believed Karen's narrative that I was an outsider attacking the good of the neighborhood. So I had to flip the story. I created a small website, willowcreektransparency.org. Simple layout, blue header, a tagline, truth, accountability, respect. On the homepage, I embedded a few publicly available city notices, redacted addresses, just proof of the inspections. Underneath, I wrote a letter. For too long, Willow Creek residents have been subject to rules not equally enforced. This isn't about rebellion. It's about fairness. I believe in this neighborhood. I believe in its people. But I also believe no one, not even the board president, should be above the law. If you agree, I ask for your signature below. Within 24 hours, I had 17 signatures, then 30, then 49. One night, I opened my email to find a message from Mrs. Alvarez, the hydrangea lady across the street. She'd always seemed quiet, sweet. She wrote, "I'm so sorry I believed her. I didn't know she was doing all this." I signed, "And I'll talk to my neighbors too." That message stayed with me. Another surprise came from Tom Burke, the HOA treasurer. He stopped by my mailbox the next morning, sunglasses on, looking like a man in the middle of a moral dilemma. "I'm not proud of how things went down," he said. "You voted for the lien," I said flatly. He nodded. "Karen pushes hard. She threatens, calls people out in private. We caved." I stared at him a moment. "Are you ready to not cave?" He nodded again. 3 days later, I submitted the petition with 74 verified homeowner signatures. Karen called an emergency meeting. This time I went, and this time I recorded everything. The clubhouse was full, not the usual 10 people, but 50, 60. Folding chairs lined the walls. Karen walked in, late hair pulled tight, wearing a white blazer like a commander walking into hostile territory. "We've all seen the rumors," she said, her voice sharp. "A smear campaign designed to destabilize our community and erode property values." She paused, let the silence thicken. "I have served this board with nothing but integrity." I stood. "Point of order," I said. Her head snapped toward me. "You don't have the floor." "Actually, I do," I replied. Article 12, Section 3.4. This is a homeowner-initiated recall. We've met the signature threshold. I handed a copy of the petition to Tom. He took it without hesitation. Karen tried to keep speaking, but the room shifted. Murmurs, then voices rising. "You fined my husband for the garden shed," one woman said. "Yours was bigger. My sunroom is being torn down because of your enforcement," another man added. Karen's face turned the color of her blazer. "You don't know what you're doing," she snapped. "This is a witch hunt." "No," I said calmly. "It's accountability. You used the rules as a weapon. Now we're using them as a mirror." Tom took a breath. "I vote to initiate a formal recall vote," he said. 2 others followed. Karen stormed out. That night, I walked past her house. The red inspection notice was still taped to her patio door, flapping in the breeze like a flag. And I realized I hadn't just won a battle. I turned the tide of the entire war. The revenge wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, but it was perfect. By the time the official recall ballots went out, the narrative had flipped. I was no longer the problem, Karen was. Her name had become shorthand for abuse of power, a kind of suburban tyranny that everyone had tolerated for far too long. And now they were done tolerating it. The votes came back swiftly. Out of 112 eligible homeowners in Willow Creek, 91 voted. Of those, 77 voted to remove Karen Templeton as president of the HOA, a landslide. The recall was official. Her tenure was over. She didn't show up to the final meeting. No farewell statement, no apology, just a resignation email forwarded by the board secretary with a one-line subject effective immediately. But I wasn't done. Removing Karen was never the end goal. This wasn't about one woman, it was about the system that enabled her. I wanted something better to take root in Willow Creek, something she could never touch again. That's when I started planning the setup. It began with a simple flyer delivered door to door in a manila envelope with no HOA logo, no political branding, just a personal message. What if our neighborhood worked for us, not against us? What if the board existed to help, not fine? Join me for coffee and an open conversation. No titles, no rules, just neighbors. The first meeting was at my house. I moved the dining room table into the living room and brought in every folding chair I owned. 15 people came. By the second week, it was 30. I served cookies and coffee, nothing fancy, but people showed up and stayed. Because for once, someone was listening instead of lecturing. I called it the Willow Creek Civic Roundtable. Each week, we discussed the HOA charter, the zoning codes, the permit process, all the tools Karen once used to intimidate, I now use to educate. I even printed small booklets breaking down what your HOA can and can't do in plain language. I kept the tone friendly, empowering, not bitter, never vindictive. But my favorite part, I created a prop, something symbolic. A single white binder with a clear plastic cover. Inside was every citation violation notice and photo I had received over the past year. On the front, in big bold letters, it read, "The binder that broke the board." Neighbors laughed when they saw it. They passed it around like a trophy. It became our inside joke, a reminder of how close we all came to losing control of our homes and how one binder handled with care had helped pull us back. At the next official HOA election, I didn't run for president. I nominated Miss Alvarez. She accepted, blushing with nerves, but won easily. Mr. Davison, the dog walker, joined the board too. So did a young couple who had nearly been fined for painting their door coral instead of approved taupe. They weren't political, they weren't power-hungry, they were fair. Exactly what we needed. But there was one final piece of the setup, my favorite one. I coordinated with the city to host a zoning awareness seminar at the Willow Creek Clubhouse. I offered to lead it myself pro bono. The city agreed. The HOA board approved it unanimously. We called it Know Your Property, a homeowner's guide to zoning permits and peace. That night, the clubhouse was full again. But this time, no one was yelling. No one was afraid. They were asking questions. They were learning. And as I stood in front of the projector, walking them through the basics of how to read a parcel map, I looked around at all those familiar faces, once skeptical, now grateful, and felt something shift inside me. Not victory, closure. As the seminar ended, someone raised their hand. "Are you going to take a seat on the new board?" I smiled. "No, I've had enough of titles. I'm just the guy with the binder." The room laughed. And somewhere out there, I hope Karen heard it. Not out of cruelty, but so she'd understand real leadership isn't about rules. It's about responsibility. You could feel the shift in the air. The summer after Karen was ousted, Willow Creek was different. Not louder, not rowdier, but lighter. Neighbors waved again. Porch lights stayed on a little longer. Kids rode bikes down the sidewalk without parents peeking nervously through blinds, worried about whether someone might complain about chalk drawings or laughter after 7 p.m. It wasn't paradise, but it was ours again. That's when the unexpected twist arrived. Karen tried to return. Not to the board, not publicly, but in influence. She resurfaced through proxies, old friends still loyal to her. One of them, a man named Paul Renshaw, ran for the vacant architectural review chair. On paper, it seemed innocent enough. He was a retired contractor. Friendly. Even shook my hand at the community BBQ. But something felt off. I started hearing things, quiet things. Miss Alvarez told me she'd received a courtesy suggestion from Paul advising her to repaint her coral door to maintain visual harmony. Mr. Davison mentioned that Paul had casually commented that his lawn was starting to reflect poorly on the street. I knew that tone. It was Karen's voice just in someone else's mouth. I didn't confront Paul. That wasn't my style. Instead, I watched, waited, documented. Then came the bombshell. A neighbor forwarded me a PDF of an unofficial document being circulated in email chains titled Willow Creek Image Standards. It looked official, formatted like a policy document, complete with a fake HOA logo and generic clip art of manicured homes. It laid out new suggestions for things like mailbox colors, acceptable yard decor, and even vehicle aesthetics. There was no vote, no board discussion, just suggestions written as veiled commands. I printed the document and highlighted 3 sections. Then I ran a simple test. I uploaded the PDF to an online metadata reader. And there it was. Author K. Templeton. Karen hadn't just returned. She was writing shadow policy under a fake document header and feeding it to the board through Paul. She couldn't help herself. But this time I didn't get angry. I smiled. Because now I had what I never had before, a unified community behind me. And that gave me the green light to expose her the right way. I called a special town hall, not a formal HOA meeting, just a community gathering at the clubhouse. I billed it as an open discussion on community communication and transparency. No drama, no accusations. People showed up curious. I printed copies of the image standards document. I handed them out quietly. Then I stepped up front, holding the copy with her name in the metadata. "This document has been circulating in our neighborhood," I said calmly. "It looks official, but it isn't." There was no vote, no authorization, and no approval. People rustled, a few gasps. I continued. The document's author, Karen Templeton. Same woman we removed. Same one whose sunroom was demolished because of her own violations. Someone in the back muttered, "You've got to be kidding me." I shook my head. No. But this time we're not playing her game. We're not fighting with fines or fear. We're responding with clarity. I proposed a resolution right there. Any and all policy changes must be voted on publicly and posted online for a 30-day review. No more informal memos, no more surprise rules. The vote unanimous. The board passed it that same week. Paul quietly resigned the next day. No explanation, just a letter folded and left at the clubhouse desk. Karen didn't try again. The final twist wasn't the fireworks. It was the silence that followed, the kind of silence that comes when fear finally dies. We didn't just stop her. We erased her influence entirely. I walked home that evening past Karen's house, still standing, still pale and pristine, but darker now. Her blinds drawn, her lawn a little overgrown, the sunroom just an empty patio. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt whole, and I realized something else. It wasn't revenge that made me feel free. It was restoration, of balance, of voice, of dignity. Sometimes justice isn't a gavel. It's a quiet vote, a clear binder, a peaceful night. The ripple effects from that night lasted longer than I expected. With Karen fully ousted and her final attempt at influence exposed, something remarkable began to happen. People stopped being afraid to speak. They stopped whispering at mailboxes and started attending meetings, not because they were scared of what might happen, but because they finally believed their voice mattered. The HOA wasn't just operating differently, it felt different, transparent, human, forgiving. Violations didn't come in red envelopes anymore. They came as friendly reminders followed by conversations. The board passed a new grace period policy that required personal outreach before any fine could even be considered. We created a neighborhood suggestion box, a real one bolted to the clubhouse wall where residents could propose improvements without fear. And perhaps most satisfying, the city's follow-up audit of Willow Creek concluded with an official letter praising our exemplary turnaround in community governance. The same zoning office Karen had feared, the one she had mocked, until it turned on her, now publicly recognized us as a model for other HOAs. Her downfall had become our framework for something better. But not everything was peaceful. A few of Karen's old allies clung to their bitterness. They wouldn't say it aloud, but their faces said everything when I passed them on the street, tight lips, eyes flicking away. To them, I'd upset the status quo, made things too soft, too democratic. One of them, Greg Harlan, who'd served as vice president during Karen's reign, made an offhand comment at a meeting one evening. We were discussing budget reallocations for common space improvements when he muttered under his breath, "Can't believe we're letting a zoning nerd dictate what this neighborhood becomes." I turned to him and smiled, calm as ever. "Greg," I said, "what this neighborhood becomes is no longer decided by one person. That's the point." A few neighbors chuckled. Greg didn't respond. That moment marked the real shift, not just the change in leadership, but the shift in culture. Karen's style had been about top-down control. Now it was lateral, collective, ground up. Still, there were consequences she couldn't escape. City zoning fines alone totaled nearly $18,000. Her sunroom, the patio, the unpermitted gas lines, all of it had to be dismantled or brought into compliance. Contractors came and went from her property for weeks. I rarely saw her, though, once I caught a glimpse of her sitting on her porch in a folding chair, staring out at the street she once ruled. Her dog barked listlessly beside her. It would be easy to feel pity, but Karen had had every chance to stop. She chose to escalate, to bully, to belittle, and now she was left with a lawn, a house, and a reputation she'd poisoned with her own ambition. The final public blow came at the HOA's annual General Assembly. We always held it at the end of the fiscal year, and this time it drew more residents than ever before. We set up folding chairs in rows outside under rented tents, passed out water bottles, even had a local food truck cater snacks. It felt less like a meeting and more like a gathering. Community, finally. I was asked to speak, not as a leader, but as a resident. Just share a few words. I stepped up to the small mic they'd rigged to the clubhouse's outdoor speakers and looked out over the crowd. "This place used to feel like a battleground," I said. "Rules used to come down like thunder, and we all flinched, wondering who was next." Heads nodded. But now it feels like a neighborhood again. Not because of any one person, but because we remembered that power works best when it's shared. That fairness isn't weakness. That kindness can be policy too. Light applause rippled through the crowd. I held up the binder, the same white one I'd shown months ago. This was once my armor, but now it's just a reminder of how far we've come. Someone shouted, "Put it in the clubhouse." And just like that, they voted informal, unanimous. The binder would be displayed in a glass case inside the clubhouse entryway, not as a warning, but as a symbol of what happens when one voice refuses to be silenced. Karen didn't attend that meeting, but her absence was loud in a way her presence never was. Because silence once used to intimidate had become our peace. It's strange how peace doesn't announce itself when it arrives. It doesn't come with banners or applause. It just settles in quietly like the way sunlight slips through blinds in the early morning, soft and steady. After everything that happened, life didn't just return to normal. It found something better than normal. The tightness in my chest I didn't realize I'd been carrying 4 months began to dissolve. I could sit on my porch again without wondering what new letter would arrive. I could walk past my neighbors without guessing which ones still believed Karen's stories. But the most surprising part, people started to confide in me. Not because I was special, not because I'd won, but because I'd endured something very public and I'd done it without lashing out. That gave others permission to be vulnerable, to share. Miss Alvarez came by one evening with a prissy and a folded letter. "Karen used to make me cry," she said quietly. She fined me for the shade of mulch I used. I didn't even know mulch had rules. She'd saved every notice in a shoebox. Now she wanted to burn them, not out of anger, just to let them go. So we did. We built a little fire pit in my backyard, burned the letters, watched the smoke rise into the night sky like ghosts finally being set free. Mr. Davison invited me to his granddaughter's graduation party. The Palmers asked me to help review their deck plans before submitting a permit request. Even the new neighbors, a young couple named Brandon and Maya, said they'd moved to Willow Creek because they heard it was one of the few HOAs that actually cared. I didn't want to be the face of the neighborhood, but I had become something else. Trusted. And with trust comes a different kind of responsibility. One I didn't expect, but welcomed. So I started writing again, not just reports or zoning analysis, but reflections, essays, stories about what happened here. I published a few anonymously online under a pen name. One went viral in a civic accountability forum. Another got shared by a nonprofit that advocates for HOA reform. It turns out our story wasn't unique, but it was rare in how it ended. Not with court battles, not with revenge fantasies, but with quiet restoration. I even received a letter, handwritten, no return address that I recognized immediately by the careful loops in the cursive. "Karen, I underestimated you," she wrote. "I thought I was protecting this place, but really I was trying to control it. I see that now. I've sold the house. I'm leaving town. I hope the neighborhood thrives without me." No apology, but maybe that was the closest she could come. I folded the letter and placed it in the binder, not as a trophy, as a footnote, a last chapter. I still work from home, still use the same desk, same monitors, but now every so often I look out the window and see a neighbor smiling as they walk past a kid on a scooter, a new tree being planted in a front yard, something that would have required a permit under the old regime. Now all it requires is a conversation. Karen left behind a lot of rules, but she also left behind a clear lesson. That fear is a terrible way to run a community. And that power unchecked is always temporary. The real strength, it's in the people who stay, who build, who rebuild. I never set out to leave a legacy. I just wanted to be left alone. But that's the funny thing about being pushed too far. When someone tries to strip you of your dignity, you either crumble or you build something stronger in its place. After the dust had long settled and the HOA returned to functioning more like a cooperative than a courtroom, I realized we had the opportunity to make sure what happened to me and to so many others never happened again. That's when I launched the Homeowners' Rights Program. It started small, just a binder of resources, the same binder actually. I added tabs for zoning laws, permit guides, and a flowchart explaining how to file and appeal HOA violations. But then I added something more important: stories. Not just mine, but others. Miss Alvarez wrote about her mulch fines. The Steiners wrote about how they nearly sold their home out of frustration. Anonymous submissions came in, 2 people who had lived in other neighborhoods and hadn't been as lucky. I made copies of the binder, shared them at every HOA meeting. Eventually, we put a digital version online. The board voted unanimously to fund an official print run, and within months, every new resident of Willow Creek received a welcome packet that included the full guide, now titled "Living Here Together, a Practical Guide to Rights, Responsibilities, and Respect in Willow Creek." It was simple, it wasn't revolutionary, but it meant something. Because it told every new neighbor you have a voice, you have rights. And no one, no board, no president, no Karen can take that away from you without a fight. And that wasn't all. The city invited me to speak at a community planning summit. A small panel, nothing formal, just homeowners and urban planners discussing how to restore trust in neighborhood governance. I stood behind a folding table with a beat-up laptop and my original binder talking about transparency and grace. I thought maybe 10 people would listen. Instead, the room was standing room only. HOA presidents, city staff, residents from 10 different districts. And I saw it in their eyes, the same fatigue I'd once felt, but also the same spark I'd eventually found. The belief that you can fight back, not with rage, but with reason. Afterwards, someone from the planning department shook my hand and said, "You turned your HOA into a neighborhood again." That's rare. That meant more to me than he probably realized. Back home, the clubhouse now has a display case by the entrance. Inside is the original binder. The binder that broke the board, along with a plaque that reads, "In honor of those who speak up, stand firm, and believe neighborhoods are for everyone." I walk by it sometimes when heading to meetings or workshops. People still joke about it. New residents see it as folklore. But for me, it's more than a symbol. It's a reminder that dignity isn't just reclaimed in courtrooms or protests. Sometimes it's reclaimed in a quiet room with a clipboard. Sometimes it starts with a $2,000 fine for working at your own desk. And sometimes it ends with a neighborhood healed. Not because of punishment, but because of accountability followed by care. That's the legacy I never planned. And it's one I'm proud to leave behind. Looking back now, I'm still surprised at how something so small unraveled into something so enormous. All I wanted was to do my job in peace. Sit at my desk, drink my coffee, and maybe if the day was kind, watch the sun shift across my blinds as I closed one zoning file and opened the next. But peace isn't always given. Sometimes it has to be claimed carefully, deliberately, and with a patience most people mistake for weakness. I never raised my voice. I never slammed a door. I didn't file lawsuits or yell across meetings. I just paid attention. I listened. And when the time came, I used what I knew not to hurt, but to restore balance. I think that's what so many people miss about justice. It isn't just about retribution. It's about restoration, about making things right in a way that lasts. Karen is gone now. Her house sold, her name no longer mentioned at board meetings. But the fear she planted left a deep root when we had to pull out together slowly and carefully. What grew in its place is better. Not perfect, but better. I still walk this neighborhood every morning. I nod to Mr. Davidson. I smile at Miss Alvarez's hydrangeas. I hear the clack of basketballs and the hum of lawnmowers and the kind of small domestic chaos that once made Karen flinch. To most, I'm just the quiet guy on Fieldstone Drive, the one who keeps to himself but always knows which permit to file. But to a few, I'm the reminder that quiet doesn't mean powerless, that patience doesn't mean surrender, and that sometimes the strongest thing you can do in the face of injustice is calmly, confidently, and completely rewrite the ending. A few months after the HOA had calmed and the binder took its place in the clubhouse, I found myself drawn into another situation, one that didn't start as a conflict, but slowly revealed itself as something much more personal. It began with a knock. Late one Sunday afternoon, I was halfway through organizing old zoning case files in my garage when I heard a hesitant rap at the front door. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, I saw a teenage boy, maybe 15 tall and thin, wearing a rumpled hoodie and scuffed sneakers. He looked up at me like I was either his last resort or his worst fear. "Mr. Mercer," he asked. I nodded. "That's me." He shifted nervously. "My mom said you helped people with HOA stuff. I mean, I don't know if this counts. It's not like an official thing or whatever, but I was wondering if I could talk to you real quick." I stepped outside and offered him the porch chair. He sat down stiffly like he wasn't used to being invited to stay. His name was Chris. His mother, Diana, had moved into one of the smaller corner lots just a few weeks prior. I remembered her quiet, polite, kept to herself. I hadn't seen a man around the house, and from what Chris said, there wasn't one. He got to the point faster than most adults ever do. "My mom's been getting these letters," he said, digging a few out of his backpack. "From the HOA, about the lawn and the fence and noise, I think." I looked over the papers, sloppy and formal, no official letterhead, vague complaints about maintenance concerns, and property neglect, with language that felt more like harassment than enforcement. None were signed. She works 2 jobs, Chris said quietly. She barely sleeps. She mows the lawn when she can. I try to help, but I've got a school and stuff, and the mower's messed up. We can't afford a new one. I looked up at him. He didn't blink, but his jaw was tight like he was holding something in. Do you know who's been leaving these, I asked. He hesitated, then nodded. There's this guy, he said. Mr. Langford lives across the back alley. He yelled at my mom once for parking too close to his hedge. I've seen him watching us. I knew Langford. Not well, but enough. Retired engineer, always in his yard pruning something. Always had a complaint about something too. He was one of those residents who thought silence was golden and children were intrusions. I tried to tell my mom to ignore it, Chris added, but she started crying the other night. She thinks we made a mistake moving here. That stayed with me. The next morning I took a walk. I passed their corner lot. The grass was a little high, maybe an inch or 2 over the edge. The fence needed a coat of paint, but it wasn't a disaster. It was a home being lived in by someone doing their best. I stopped by Langford's on the way back. His garage was open. He was polishing the side of his riding mower like it was a sports car. Morning, I said casually. He gave me a stiff nod. Mercer. I heard there have been some concerns about Diana's property. He barely looked up. It reflects poorly, brings down the block. You know that. She moved in 3 weeks ago. Long enough. I let the silence hang a moment. You've been leaving letters. He turned toward me, tightening his lips. They needed to be said. If the board won't act, someone has to. The board doesn't act on unsigned letters anymore. New policy. He scowled. She doesn't belong here. Single mother, teenage son, working odd hours. It's not what this neighborhood was built for. There it was. Not a complaint about grass or fences. A complaint about people. I looked at him calmly, steadily. I think what this neighborhood was built for is changing. You might want to keep up. I didn't wait for a response. I walked home, printed copies of the unsigned notes, and brought them to the board that evening. We had a policy now. Everything had to be transparent, traceable, and fair. By the end of the week, Langford received a formal written warning, not for the notes which we couldn't legally penalize, but for trespassing and harassment. He tried to protest, claimed he was defending the integrity of the neighborhood, but no one stood with him, not anymore. That Saturday, I showed up at Diana's place with a lawnmower. She opened the door, tired but alert. Chris told me, she said, you didn't have to get involved. I did, I said, because this neighborhood belongs to you just as much as anyone else. We mowed the lawn together, painted the fence. Chris helped too, brushing broad strokes with teenage focus while his mom smiled for the first time that day. A week later, I watched them host a small cookout in their yard, just a few folding chairs, a grill laughter echoing into the evening air. The same corner that once felt like a target now felt like home. Not just for them, for me too. Sometimes justice doesn't come from courtrooms or citations. Sometimes it comes from standing quietly beside someone until they remember they don't have to stand alone. And sometimes the best revenge isn't policy or paperwork. It's making sure the people who were once pushed to the margins end up right in the center of the story, where they belong.